The issue of transformation has come up in ecumenical discussion at the latest since we chose the theme for the WCC assembly at Porto Alegre. God in your grace transform the world. I still remember our discussion about shaping this theme in this very room. Prior to the assembly, it was at the very end of my service as General Secretary. And I was struck that in a way this prayer has continued to accompany the work of the World Council of Churches since this assembly in 2006. But then I realized as I looked back on the journey that I have tried to describe in this book, I realized that almost since my very first assignment as a study secretary in Faith and Order, and I see Renate Spegen, she was my first colleague in Faith and Order, trying to articulate my own thoughts as a young theologian coming from Germany. But I realized that from this very first assignment, I was continuously involved in trying to struggle with responding to processes of change and transformation in the world around us, in the life of the churches, and then consequently also in the life of the World Council of Churches, trying to be attentive and responsive to those movements of change and transformation. And to turn those experiences of change from something that can be overwhelming and that can be suffered into something that becomes a constructive moment for transformation, for shaping something new. As that to call it the challenge of transformation.
You've spoken about movements of transformation and change that affect us all, the world around us, the churches, the WCC. What would you say, looking back over the past 5 decades, were the most important movements of transformation or change that the WCC had to face, and why?
When I came, there was a program even, participation in change. Some of the old colleagues may remember this, located in the still existing Department of Ecumenical Action, coordinated by Ernst Lange and Jean Fraser. And Jean Fraser in particular, trying to promote this understanding of participation in change. The first momentous processes of change were, of course, associated with the programs launched after the Uppsala Assembly. At the time that I came into the World Council of Churches, the program to combat racism, the program of the Church's participation in development, the new program on ecumenical education and ecumenical learning, the processes that started with the assembly of the WCC in Nairobi in 1975 on the community of the churches, a community of women and men in the church, and then continuing into the decade of the churches in solidarity with women. So all of these were indications of a process of change germinating that was seeking articulation in different points, in different formats. And some of these I have referred to in the book. Of course, this is not, and it doesn't pretend to be anything of the kind of an institutional history of the World Council of Churches as a whole. I have limited myself to those features that I participated in, that I was involved in directly, or had in some way overall responsibility for. Many features that under the heading of responding to the challenge of transformation could and should have been mentioned are only touched upon in the book. So don't consider this to be an authoritative account of all the processes that we have moved through in these almost 50 years. It's, in that sense, it's a personal account.
As we've said already, you arrived at the WCC in 1969, soon after the Uppsala Assembly, as a young study secretary in Faith and Order. You spent a year at Harvard, but otherwise most of your studies was in a German academic setting. Was there any kind of culture shock when you arrived at the WCC in a multicultural environment with people of quite different backgrounds and ideas, and maybe different ways of thinking about dealing with theology than may have taken place in the German faculties at the time?
No, I wouldn't call it culture shock. I mean, it was a tremendous opportunity to expose myself, to expose ourselves together, Elizabeth and myself, and our yet very small family, to the multicultural setting that the World Council of Churches represented at that time, with almost 300 colleagues that we had, or more than 300 colleagues that we had at the time that I came to the World Council of Churches. The multitude of languages, and of course I realized how much I had been shaped by a particular German culture and a tradition of doing theology. In a way, the encounter with people from very different backgrounds makes you aware where you have come from, and obliges you to develop an attitude, a positive attitude, perhaps also a critical attitude towards those forces that have shaped you. But it was certainly not a culture shock. To the contrary, when I think I referred to this, when I left the World Council of Churches after 14 years of service in 1983 to return to Germany, and I was asked to reflect back on these 14 years. It occurred to me that I said, to a certain extent, it has been an experience like a second conversion. That is to say, you discover a new identity, a new spiritual identity, a new personal identity through these many encounters, living in the context of the way the church has provided. And it also has led to the fact that I have accepted ecumenism and the ecumenical movement as my vocation. When I came here as a young theologian, I thought it would be an excellent opportunity to widen my horizon, to learn about different facets of the life of the church worldwide, but then to return back to Germany and to serve as a parish pastor. I didn't come here with the expectation that this would continue to shape my life for the following decades. So, culture shock, no, it was a tremendous gift and opportunity.
Just come back to the culture shock for a minute, or differences maybe. In your book, you describe about how at the time when you arrived in the Ecumenical Centre, there was a tea trolley that used to come round in mid-morning with a bell for tea or coffee and croissants, and you were this offers an opportunity to meet and encounter and discuss with other colleagues. And you mentioned how one of the colleagues, David Jenkins, who was then the coordinator of the Humanum studies, almost sometimes literally pinned you to the wall with discussions. And I think you wrote something like that it was a very different style of theology from the German academic tradition. The Anglican tradition was a different kind of way of doing theology, and you couldn't always follow what he was saying exactly, but you knew it was important. And what would you say? I mean, there's different figures and personalities that come up in this book. What would you say were the key people within the World Council of Churches that influenced you and shaped you? Some may be well known, some may be lesser known.
Yeah, you refer to David Jenkins and our early experience on the third floor in Jura. And Dwayne is sitting there, and we were on the same floor and had these impromptu meetings around the coffee trolley in the morning. And David Jenkins was a very vigorous speaker. And with our coffee in one hand and the croissant in the other hand, we walked back and past his office door. And as you say, he so intensely argued with me that I felt myself literally put against the wall. It was a way of articulating theology and thinking theologically that was very foreign to me. And I had great difficulty in the beginning to even follow his written arguments. But then as he drew me into a small advisory group on the Humanum studies, and it was through the intensive dialogue in this small group that I began to realize how fundamental the insights were that he was trying to articulate as the coordinator of the Humanum studies at that time. But you asked about personalities that may have influenced me, and of course I must say that the one personality that influenced me was Philip Potter, and I have, in the end of the foreword for the book, dedicated it to the memory of Philip, because whatever I have become in terms of an ecumenical figure and ecumenical theologian, I have become through Philip. Perhaps I should also acknowledge that, of course, my early mentor was Lucas Fischer as director of Faith and Order. And when you read this book, you realize how much my early acquaintance with Faith and Order has continued to shape many of the things that I have tried to follow through in the years afterwards. But really working within the ecumenical movement, that I learned through Philip Potter. Staccato Paul referred to me as a giant. I must say I'm amused by this, because throughout the time I worked for the World Council of Churches, I always was the youngest. I came in as a very young German theologian to Faith and Order. I was the youngest among the team in Faith and Order, with very seasoned colleagues like Father Vitali Borovoy and Lucas Fischer and John Zizioulas, now Metropolitan, John of Pergamon. I was the youngest in the General Secretariat team. I was the youngest among the directors of program units and subunits, whom I tried to coordinate as Deputy General Secretary for program coordination. And I had great respect for those seasoned figures. And all I could rely on was the trust and the authority of Philip, who had called me to that place. And I had no power, no authority on my own. It was all borrowed, as it were, from Philip. And even then later, when I came back as General Secretary, I still was the youngest. And so to consider myself a giant is somewhat amusing. And as I look at the room here and see Baldwin and Luke and Tom Wieser, these were the ones to whom I looked, because they had much longer experience with the World Council of Churches than I could have claimed. The 50 years that are part of my own experience are short in comparison to what Baudouin and Tom Wieser can bring in. So to come back to the beginning of the question, really the one person who shaped my thinking, my understanding of the World Council of Churches, including that emphasis on strengthening the fellowship of churches, that is the heritage of Philip, and I tried as best as I could to continue this and bring it to life.
The subtitle of your book is An Ecumenical Journey. My first question on that is, what would you say for you personally were the greatest challenges in that ecumenical journey, and what were the insights you got from it?
Yeah, many things could be mentioned, but since you asked for the greatest challenge, I think the greatest challenge is associated with what I encountered when I came back as General Secretary, with a process that had begun at the Center Committee meeting in Moscow in 1989, asking the General Secretary to initiate a process of consultation among member churches about a common understanding and vision of the WCC, acknowledging that the historic process of change that had taken place in Europe had long-term effects on the World Council of Churches, that the WCC had been shaped in its mode of action, in its self-understanding, perhaps more than we were able to acknowledge at the same time, by the spirit of the Cold War, by the antagonism of the spirit of the Cold War. And that now, since this period had come to an end, the WCC was challenged to reassess its understanding and its vision for the fellowship of churches. It turned out that this challenge to the member churches to articulate what for them the common understanding and vision of the World Council was a failure. Because the distance between the member churches and the World Council had grown to an extent that for most of them, the WCC was at best a funding organization and perhaps an instrument to articulate some political, social and political demands on the international level. But what this invitation to articulate a common understanding and vision meant in ecclesial terms, in theological terms, in spiritual terms, the member churches were not really in a position to respond to. So we had to shift the challenge into something addressed to the World Council of Churches as a body trying to articulate self-understanding and to do it in a manner that could become the basis for an act of recommitment when we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the founding of the WCC in Harare. And that, I think, was the greatest challenge that I faced, trying to give shape to this process. And there were lots of doubts, there were lots of critical concerns and questions articulated among close colleagues. And I was not always sure that we were trying to trace a viable and responsible course. So struggling through that challenge of transforming understanding and vision of the WCC to the point that Staccato Paul has referred to the document on common understanding and vision, that I think was the greatest challenge. And then, of course, the consequences that followed from that, not least in trying to come to a new understanding of the participation and relationship of Orthodox churches with the WCC. That was part of the central challenge.
Thank you. Time has run out for this part of the panel. At this stage, we will have a short removal of chairs. This is not the end of the opportunity for discussion. There's many opportunities throughout the day. But I would like to thank Konrad for this first section and look forward to the discussions that will continue. Thank you.
Looking back, but as I said, we also have this perspective on looking forward. I mean, where do we see today the fruits of yesterday, but also how do we bring them forward to the life of the council, to the life of the churches, to the challenges in the world we shall address as churches and as World Council churches today and tomorrow. So if I may add to the dates and reflection about the dates I had early on, in the same email from the Geneva authorities, I got another message, namely that the area plan to totally rebuild this asset has been finally approved by the Geneva authorities. So we have a future of renovating this building so that it can also be used for other purposes than cafeterias and seminariums, but also as a working place more, in addition to keeping this and the chapel as they are, but also building other buildings for many reasons, for financial reasons, but also for reasons of using this as an asset, not only for us, but for Geneva and for the international community in Geneva to live in, to have a hotel here, to have restaurants here, and many offices. So we are also on the step towards the next, with this date of the 26th. But I also want to say that in this gathering here, we have the Assembly Planning Committee for the 11th Assembly present. We are having a working session, our first working session these days. So this is also a gift to us to reflect on what does it mean to prepare an assembly. We have colleagues here, and maybe we would have more colleagues here if we were not 4 weeks before the next World Conference on Mission and Evangelism in Arusha in Tanzania, which is a major event in this period between the 10th and 11th Assembly. We have many colleagues and others who are in Colombia for the reference group on the pilgrimage of justice and peace. And we are in many ways busy with what we are called to do. But this is an opportunity really to reflect on what brings you and your time into our time. And we have asked two other significant colleagues and also the persons who have known the history you are talking about, but also who know the present, to address this together with us. George Lemopoulos, the former Deputy General Secretary, and Dr. Agnes Abuom, the present moderator of the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches. We also had invited Miriam Weiby, a member of the Central Committee and also a member of the Assembly Planning Committee, but unfortunately she is ill today. I will add two questions that she could have asked, and we will give a bit space then for the floor to ask questions. So we will use the time well. George.
Thank you.
Yorgo Lemopoulos.
Thank you, Olav. Dear, yeah, it's on, I think. Dear Konrad, dear colleagues, just a few thoughts focusing on commitment to unity and fellowship. Speaking at his time about the future of the ecumenical movement, and I was asked to be rather forward-looking, Dr. Fykse Tveit had observed that the ecumenical journey is like Abraham's journey when God commanded him to leave his country to go in the direction that God shows. So that was the direction of unity, according to Fykse Tveit, but without knowing much except that God is asking us to do certain things today and may ask us to do certain other things tomorrow. I think that these few lines help us to better understand what one can find throughout Konrad's memories. The direction taken by the Council, by the ecumenical movement, with no doubt has always been the direction of unity. However, because of the changing ecclesial, ecumenical, and political landscape, in order to fulfill its purpose, the Council has always tried to do things differently. So, let me give few examples focusing on the search for unity. At New Delhi, the vision of the all in each place linked to the all in every place. And this was the dynamic between the local and universal. In Uppsala, the vision of conciliar fellowship was developed, suggesting a life for the churches, which could become a sign of the coming unity of humankind. In Nairobi, the stress was on the marks of conciliar fellowship: common faith, baptism, Eucharist, ministry, conciliar gathering. And this was almost a breakthrough for many of member churches. Vancouver emphasized the Eucharistic vision encompassing the unity and renewal of the church with the vocation to work for the healing and destiny of human community. Lastly, Busan insisted that God's call to the church was to serve the unity of the church, but also the unity of humankind and the unity of all creation. And this is what I think you underline in your last chapter, Konrad. The vocation of the church would be, according to Busan, to become a prophetic sign of the life God intends for all, and also a servant spreading the good news of God's kingdom of justice, peace, and love. I am not selective of the assemblies because the one is more important than the other. I just picked up one or two as an example for the sake of time. And what I'm trying to say is that each attempt by the World Council of Churches to describe that unity we seek as a fellowship in the World Council of Churches, to move in the direction of unity, as Vissertuf says, and to make a progress towards this unity, was definitely a product of its time. And this is, I think, the strength of the World Council of Churches, to find the most appropriate way and the most appropriate language to act in a certain period of time. And I think, most likely, I'm not a prophet, but this is the way I feel things, most likely this pattern will continue in the coming years, as the Council, in its vocation to work for unity, will continue to face the triple challenge it has faced so far. And this would consist, in my reading, one, that the Council had to listen very carefully and analyze the changing ecclesial, ecumenical, and political landscape at each time, then to try to incorporate in its vision new insights and experiences from its programmatic activities. Here we are in a circle. The programmatic activities try to respond to the new challenges, and then they offer new insights and new vision. Church and Society before Uppsala, GPIC before Canberra, and there are many other examples one can give. And finally, of course, identifying the ecclesiological and other difficulties or opportunities among member churches and ecumenical partners. Now, here I try to look forward, and my inclination, and most of you know that I am rather optimistic when I look at the future. It's to say that in the coming years, the Council could and should continue working in the direction pointed to by Busan, insisting on one of its deepest convictions, repeated throughout the 70 years of its existence, and pointing always to the same direction, which is the direction of unity. The Church is called to be a prophetic sign, a prophetic community, through which and by which transformation of the world can take place. In saying this, I have in mind a few indications, and this is again very personal reading, about each of the three factors I have just mentioned. With regard to the changing ecumenical and political landscape, just to give only one example, I hear Reverend Sang Chang, WCC Asia President, proposing an analysis which seems to be shared by member churches and ecumenical partners. A few weeks ago, she was saying in China that the 21st century Christianity must take note of the issue of world peace. Today's world is characterized by severe conflict, division, and violence, from racial strife, religious strife, economic strife, political strife, environmental crisis, and furthermore, nuclear crisis. I believe for the Church's witness in today's rapidly changing geopolitical arena, the biblical understanding of peace with justice and reconciliation is of utmost importance. The 21st century Christianity must struggle to bring about world peace with justice. So it is one affirmation indicating us where we should be moving, and I think it's very close to Busan vision. With regard to the ongoing programmatic work of the Council, the strategic and programmatic proposal made in Busan for a pilgrimage of justice and peace was, at least in my reading, positively received by member churches and ecumenical partners, and has offered many occasions for common reflection and work on unity. And, by the way, seems to be a very promising frame for the future. I think also that Chapter 4 of the Faith Order document, The Church Towards a Common Vision, the chapter particularly on the Church in and for the world, again, if my understanding is correct, is appreciated and widely discussed by churches. Then another indication is that ecumenical and international organizations appreciate the work of the Council in many areas: peace, justice, human rights, health, migration, education. This is a real contribution churches can make to the wider society, to the international arena. And therefore, both those international and ecumenical partners invite the Council and member churches to claim a key role, in fact, to offer a common Christian witness in dealing with the challenges and divisive forces within the world today. So these and many other programmatic activities and opportunities will continue encouraging the Council to continue holding its vision of unity, which is broad enough, since it includes the Church, humanity, and the creation, and holds together both the social dimension and the spiritual dimension of ecumenism. Finally, with regard to ecumenical partners and member churches, I believe, again, just to give an example, that the direction taken by Pope Francis is very close to the one proposed for so many years by the Council. There is a potential in the Pope's vision, not very far from the concept of a pilgrimage of justice and peace, as he states that unity is achieved by journeying, to recall that when we journey together, that is when we encounter each other as sisters and brothers, when we pray together and collaborate together in proclaiming the gospel and in the service of others, we are already united. And more recently, the Pope affirmed that he was reminded of the Lund principle, being in Lund itself, and he repeated the Lund principle. And I see also here and there voices of prominent Catholic hierarchs or theologians. I just have here a quotation from the Archbishop of Washington, Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, who says, drawing from experience in the United States, he speaks of the context he knows, we know just how fruitful ecumenical dialogue and collaboration can be. The diverse faith tradition here have a history of coming together in common cause to improve the human condition. Whether it was the abolition of slavery in the 19th century or the struggle for human rights, social justice and peace in the 20th and 21st centuries, Catholics, Baptists, Lutherans, Episcopalians, Methodists, and so on, found themselves working together side by side. Another area of influence involved just war principles and efforts for peace. Today, these teachings, which find agreement in other Christian communities, can also serve to foster efforts towards unity within the body of Christ. And here I find this dialectic of unity of the church, unity of humankind, very obvious and very clear in the mouth of a Roman Catholic hierarch. Last but not least, always in the same direction, without underestimating the complexity of inter-Orthodox dynamics and the complications of Orthodox participation in the ecumenical movement. We know something about that, Konrad. Yeah. It would be important for the Council to take advantage of, explore, and build on one key affirmation of the Great and Holy Council, that the local Orthodox churches that are members of the Council participate fully and equally in the WCC, contributing with all means at their disposal to the advancement of peaceful coexistence and cooperation in the major socio-political challenges. So there also one can discern the concern for the unity of humankind. Now I shift from the direction to unity and I go to the notion of fellowship to conclude. And my feeling is that to persist in following this direction of unity, the Council will have to continue, insistently, to continue building on its self-identity as a fellowship of churches. Since this unique fellowship of churches has all the potential to become the sign and the foretaste, here and now, of that vision of unity and of how new agendas could be embraced to promote the vision. However, this would entail to continue and even to intensify reflection upon the quality of life experience within the fellowship, the functions, structures, and membership of the WCC. We are not in the pre-CUV period. We are in the post-CUV period. One can see some of the results and some of the fruits, but we should not consider the results of CUV and of the Special Commission, I will add, as a work already completed. They should be revisited again and again. Because I think what is the most important, Konrad, all this struggle around the fellowship of churches and the Special Commission had as a result for churches and ecumenical partners to better understand that the ecumenical space created by the fellowship of churches needs to be sustained and nurtured continually. It cannot be taken for granted. So probably this should be the constant in the context of the changing landscapes and agendas. We do have a solid ground, a foundation on which the Council could build according to the needs of the times. We have a capital, but we are not allowed to put the capital under the shelf. We have to struggle for it. So for the Council as a fellowship of churches is a unique space where trust could be created and built up, where member churches are able to develop, but also to discuss, review, and deepen their own conceptions of the world, their particular social work, and their liturgical and doctrinal traditions, encountering one another at a deeper level. The insights offered by both the CUV, and when I think back of CUV, I would summarize it in two important, among many other elements. There's clear distinction between the World Council of Churches as an institution and as a fellowship of churches, and putting all the emphasis on the primacy of the fellowship of churches, and trying to describe the role of the World Council of Churches within the ecumenical movement. And we have one of the results of this vision in the composition of the Assembly Planning Committee, and we have the results of CUV in the way the Assembly in Busan was organized. But also of the Special Commission, and again, to give only one example, I think the whole ethos of consensus, the whole ethos of searching together for the way, do not belong to the past. It is a legacy that should and could inform, direct, and strengthen the work of the Council in the coming years. So, dear Konrad, for your role and your contribution in shaping this legacy, we are deeply indebted to you, and we thank you very much. And if I am allowed to add one more word on a very personal record, we are celebrating the 70th anniversary of the World Council of Churches. But when I look around this room, I don't see only decades of service to the World Council of Churches, but if you add the years of service of colleagues, you will find few centuries of dedicated and committed service to the World Council of Churches. And this is also one of the capitals. And thank you to all of you for your friendship and our collaboration.
Thank you, Jorgo. We will give you a chance to respond when you have heard both of them. Dr. Agnes, you are the moderator of the Central Committee. Most often you sit here and ask us to speak or ask somebody else to speak, together with His Eminence Metropolitan Gennadius, who is also the vice moderator, but also the moderator of the Assembly Planning Committee and present among us, or the vice moderator, Bishop Marianne Swenson, who is not here today. But today we ask you to take another role, to be the one who speaks, to reflect also in a critical way, but also in a visionary way, as you know that you can. What does justice and peace mean to the WCC today?
Good morning, friends and colleagues. It's such a wonderful day to see some of the stalwarts of the ecumenical movement convening around you, Konrad. And thank you for giving us this space to actually look back, look at where we are, but also begin to think about the future. We are told that we have eyes in front because we do not have to dwell in looking at the past, but to keep focusing towards the future. And that is why we are here. I want to thank you for sharing, Konrad, your reflections from your lenses, your experience. And I perhaps may not be the very best person to reflect on this theme of justice and peace, but I come with my lenses because I was a young woman under your feet and Philip Potter and a few of you here that nurtured me, having come to the ecumenical movement through the back door. The back door because the systems and structures of my country would not allow for justice and public space engagement. I want to pick a couple of things that are in your last chapter as I reflect on the future to actually contextualize them within the journey of 70 years. Justice and peace have been central motives in the World Council of Churches and in the ecumenical movement. When we look at the life and work process led by none other than the Archbishop of the Church of Sweden, it really was affirming the dignity, the rights of workers in an industrial setting, of which I would say, perhaps after rural-urban program of the World Council of Churches, we have somewhat not engaged fully with the working class. And this is because the labor situation has transformed radically. We have turned away from secure labor and employer relationships to casual labor, undermining the rights of workers, the security of workers, And it is in this life and work movement that reflection was located. And as we move into the future, I would like to invite us as a World Council of Churches and the Ecumenical movement to look at the changing landscape of labor and laborers. Just last week, I was sharing with my church about how the African young person doesn't know why they wear the trousers hanging down, having failed to understand the whole history of the African American slave labor, that they were not even allowed to take water, and the trousers would be falling and could not even lift them up because they were to work so hard. So I think when I reflect on the life and work that is the foundation of justice and peace work in the World Council of Churches, I would like to bring to the center the issue of labor and workers, who today we talk about migrant workers, trafficking of human lives. Secondly, I'd like to come to a subject that you yourself have picked up, and that is just, participatory, and sustainable society. The JPSS initiative of the World Council of Churches and its fellowship was a critical process of reflection, both theologically, economically, socially, but also in practicing and challenging the unjust models of development that had left so many millions, if not billions, of people poor and marginalized. In fact, JPSS and the Commission on Churches' Participation in Development challenged the notion that development was structural and not people-centered. Today, the same actors in the public space, globally, nationally, have embraced the principles of participation, empowerment, but in a way that still helps the forces of oppression to oppress and continue with a model of socio-economic development that only a few rich siphon the blood and the resources of the world. You will remember, Konrad, that JPSS and CCPD were seriously criticized and undermined at the Jamaica Central Committee. And this reappeared actually at Port Alegre when we were challenging global financial institutions. And I want to say that this debate needs to be reopened so that all the voices are brought to the table and we can look again at the church's offer in terms of what we understand development to be. You also have reflected a bit on the justice, peace, and integrity of creation, which came out of the Vancouver Assembly. And we had a lot of convocations, both in Europe, and I think it was referred to by our preacher this morning, a very difficult process in Seoul on JPIC. The JPIC process and the convocations and materials were not only biblical, but they brought to the forefront and linked the issues of justice, peace, and creation, integrity of creation. We in Africa worked very closely with the churches in Uganda and Liberia, which were post-conflict countries, to actually look at how sustaining integrity of creation, God's people, would be done by the churches and affirmed. And so JPIC today, when the men and women of faith met in Paris, I think we saw a voice, a collective voice saying enough is enough to the model that does not respect creation. This is an area, in my view, and which we've been running with, but which will need enhanced reflection, enhanced collective action, and public engagement to actually save the Mother Earth. Professor Wangari Maathai says, if you mistreat nature, nature will come back and hit you hard. And we are seeing it already. And so it is my hope that as we celebrate 70 years, we will look at the various experiences in the movement that have sought to address issues of environment, creation. There were even communities that were living alternative lifestyles. And you yourself and Elizabeth came here by train as a manifestation of seeking to change our lifestyles. The whole discussion on just peace and just war that began in Canberra, I want to say that, and I submit, that while this debate dominated the Assembly and even the Berlin Central Committee, we seem to have moved somewhat to embrace the civil rights approach to nonviolence, to peace, recognizing, of course, the challenge of the weapons of mass destruction. We see increased involvement globally, and especially in the global south, in seeking alternative ways to conflict resolution. And I'll be coming back to that. The Central Committee in South Africa in 1994 was challenged by Bishop Mangobe when he cried out about violence in the cities. Because somehow, church life in the cities had not adequately addressed poverty in the cities, crime in the cities, and violence in the cities. And you rightly lift up the issue of the program on peace in the cities, the 7 cities. And today, may I dare say that our cities, men and women, boys and girls, are crying for peace because somehow we go for evangelism, but not for addressing the injustices in the cities faced by migrants, urban-rural migration. The decade to overcome violence was the result, and of course, we also had the decade of churches in solidarity with the women. The results of the decade of churches in solidarity with women were very dismal, because it was women in solidarity with women and not churches in solidarity with women. This is an unfinished business of the Ecumenical movement and the World Council of Churches. It is an unfinished because whilst we celebrate the ordination of women, the power structures and power relations remain, and the power and culture of organizations remain dominantly male-oriented. And so those, particularly in the South, who've been ordained, sometimes are relegated to minor pastoral duties rather than really sharing at the table of our Lord Jesus Christ. And it's not just ministry. I'm talking about the community of men and women on the journey of witnessing to the good news of our Lord Jesus Christ. The pilgrimage of justice and peace as given to us then is an important landmark in the 70 years journey that we've been undertaking. First, it does affirm the need that we need to move together, we need to stay together, we need to act together, and we need each other. We need all the narratives around justice. Justice has been a very critical issue, but also sometimes a dividing issue. I see my brother Sholema in the room, and he will narrate he has already narrated, in fact, how the program to combat racism was a major challenge and remains a challenge to the movement. We have come back to square one of racism and xenophobia. So, pilgrimage of justice and peace is a central motive in our journey and will remain so. Because without justice, there will be no peace. And justice has to be secured in terms of governance, in terms of both economic and political, so that we can actually continue to share in the resources that God has given us. As I conclude, I'd like to draw on two experiences I just had recently to show why the pillar of justice and peace is critical. As pilgrims, we must heal our heart wounds and heal our wounded history. We belong to our histories that are wounded and that have wounded each other, whether through colonization and decolonization processes, or through slavery and ongoing enslavement. And this needs to be looked at seriously, because as I visited Burundi, a country that has had and experienced cycles of violence, one of the major undertakings in the area of justice and peace is peace building and trauma healing. The levels of trauma are different, the causes of trauma are different, but we all are traumatized and have been traumatized by one experience or the other. And so, whilst we talk about justice and peace, and as we pilgrimage together, we are being asked by quarters of our constituencies to consider healing, forgiveness, restitution, reparation. Secondly, we were in Ghana at Elmina Castle, looking at the legacies of slavery, a very fundamental area of injustice, still manifested today in our daily lives. Today we are talking about building of walls to separate people, breaking of bridges not to allow movement. And what Elmina Castle reminded us was the abuse and misuse of faith to actually endorse injustice. On top of the cells of slaves, you have a chapel that quotes Psalms 32. On top of the female cells, you have a chapel where the governor would come and move a woman. They would wash her for him. Brothers and sisters, this may not be quite the same, but the dehumanizing forces, the enslaving forces, remain the same, manifest themselves differently. Justice and peace, as pilgrims, is important for us. We need to be in the public space to challenge the unjust structures. We need to be prophetic with relevant messages. Today we are invited to sit at the table. I wonder whether we are going to be as Lazarus or whether we will sit at the table in a corner where some dishes are served and the choice food is passed on to others. It is a challenge for us as faith communities who are now invited to sit at the global tables and who are instrumental in the constitution of the Articles of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, to review our journey as salt and as light. I conclude by saying that just last week, in fact on Friday, the church in South Sudan had put together 15 men and women to go and participate in accompanying the peace negotiations that can bring peace to that country. Justice and peace is both implementation level, where we build capacities for peace, for healing, for reconciliation, but it is also about dialogue with the structures that perpetrate injustice. Over 2,000 years ago, the journey of seeking peace through loving our neighbor is as relevant and urgent, especially in the face of weapons of mass destruction, unjust and greedy, exploitative structures of Mother Earth and human beings. The unity of the church will never be real until we look at the dignity and integrity of our neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnes. I think we ask you, Konrad, to respond to this before we move forward. I think you have a lot in these two presentations you could respond to.
Yeah, indeed, there is a lot that invites responses. Let me start with Yorgos' remarks. I think one of the most significant developments that I recognize in the discussion on unity is to acknowledge unity not as an institutional, structural, conceptual fact, but as a living process. Unity is not something to be reached at one eschatological moment, but it is part of the quality of fellowship that we are constantly building and working and trying to develop further. So, to begin to understand unity, not as a distant goal, but as something that is part of the reality that we experience now, and that is open towards the future, is for me one of the essential points that is reflected in the last of these official declarations on unity, the one that has come from Busan, which for me also reflects the fundamental learning process that has finally been achieved, to see the inseparable interrelationship between what we call the unity of the church and the unity of humankind. I refer to this in the concluding chapter of the book because it is the first of the challenges of transformation that I encountered when I joined the WCC. And at that time, my sense was that the Faith and Order Commission was not prepared to really accept the challenge. The Faith and Order Commission felt too comfortable with the traditional discussion of the unity of the church as an ecclesiological issue. But opening it to the challenges of living in community in the world around us was too much of an imposition. Unfortunately, the very, very creative discussion that took place at that time in the Commission meeting in Louvain in 1971 was never published. So it remained like the report of the advisory group on just, participatory and sustainable society. It remained one of the secrets hidden in the archives of potential that still had to be reaped and turned into living reality. So, secondly, and this relates to both Agnes and Jorgo. In my involvement in the discussions on justice and peace, both separately and in the interrelationship between justice and peace, I've come to realize more and more that we will not move significantly unless we address the hidden issues of power. The understandings and the practice of power, the institutions and the structures of power. As some of you realize, this was the conclusion of the advisory group on just, participatory and sustainable society. And at that time, we challenged the World Council of Churches to address the question of political ethics focused on the understanding and practice of power. I still think that the consultation that we had in Cyprus on political ethics was one of the most promising efforts in the whole field of justice and peace. We returned to this not very convinced and not very strongly in the context of the Decade to Overcome Violence. And there was an effort to lift up the fundamental issues of power. We came to it when we were responding to the events of the 11th of September 2001, and began to discuss the symbolic power represented by religious and economic symbols, the towers, the Twin Towers, as symbolic representations of a particular form of power. I have, after leaving the WCC, I've tried to dig further into this field in my book on religion, power, and politics. And I still think we need to wrestle with this issue. To some extent, it will come back to us when we continue the discussion on ecumenical diaconia, because hidden behind the question of diaconia and the new responding to the new paradigm of development is also the question how we respond to the manifestations, the institutional manifestations of power, the misuse of power in the international structures. So, third response, this picks up Jorgo's remarks at the very end on the question of fellowship. I agree that we need to work further on the distinction between our understanding of the WCC as a fellowship of churches and as an institution trying to integrate the one ecumenical movement. We have perhaps been, in the context of the process of globalization, and even prior to that, we were tempted again and again to look at the place and the role of the WCC as one of the international organizations, non-governmental international organizations, trying to get a voice, trying through act of advocacy and influencing international structures to bring a witness. I still believe that even the public role of the WCC focuses finally around the question how we manifest the quality of fellowship. The quality of fellowship is a political witness as well. And it is the decisive political witness that through our fellowship, through the way we shape this fellowship of churches, we do give an indication of a different way of organizing, shaping, structuring human relationships and community relationships, not according to the dominant political power structures. So I think the focus on the fellowship of churches and the quality of the fellowship of churches is not, in the first instance, a theological and ecclesiological and spiritual exercise. It points to the very identity of the World Council of Churches among the circle of international organizations. So distinguishing between the fellowship and the institution is necessary for conceptual purposes. But the two cannot and must not be separated from one another. Even the institutional life of the World Council of Churches must visibly reflect that we are a fellowship of churches. That must be visible in the quality even of our institutional life. And then a final remark. I was very happy that Agnes, in several points, picked up that dimension that I tried to refer to in the final chapter, this tension between the local and the global, and the fact that we have at decisive points been called to come back and face local realities, local experiences, and not be tempted and absorbed to move on the global structural and conceptual level. This happened to us in the struggles around the Seoul Convocation on justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. It happened to us at the meeting in El Escorial on the sharing of resources. Agnes points to the challenge of the working community, migrant workers. I remember when Pope John Paul II published his encyclical Laborem Exercens. I felt that this was an opportunity for us to respond to this focus placed on the reality of labor, the experience of the laboring population. Unfortunately, we were not able to respond. Even though this encyclical had so much to do with our work, but the realities of the experience of labor had not really been part of our screen. I was very happy that Agnes referred to the struggles both in the work of CCPD and then later in the discussion on political ethics, on the people-centered approach. The emphasis on people's participation in development and not leaving it with development as a structural concept. The understanding of power or of politics as church-centered, as state-centered, and as people-centered. I think the unique contribution that the World Council and the Ecumenical Movement in its various expressions, the unique contribution that we can and should continue to be making is that we bring the local experience of people into the debate and not allow it to be pushed into the background, into the margin. And a final word. In this book, I refer too little to the very important processes that started with the consultation on sexism in the 70s in Berlin in 1974, moved into the community study, started in 1975, and then continued with the decade of Churches in Solidarity with Women. I think Agnes is right that this is a challenge of transformation that stays with us, and we have not really responded to the challenge yet. And it links up with what I said on power, because ultimately what is involved in so far the inability of the churches to really enter the process of solidarity with women is the tradition of patriarchate as a particular manifestation of power, as a cultural manifestation of power with very, very deep roots in the tradition of our churches. And unless we find ways to address this constructively and to accept the challenge of transformation that is hidden here, we will not have really responded to the legacy that has been with us with these processes on the community study and the decade Churches in Solidarity with Women. I should have brought this out more clearly in the book, but it's one of the gaps, and you will discover many others. So,
Thank you. We have an opportunity to open the floor for questions and comments. I'm sure that there are some who have them. We have one microphone over there, and we have one here. So we ask you to use them to raise your question or share your comment, but also to say who you are. Please.
Thank you. I'm Ralston Deffenbaugh, recently retired from the Lutheran World Federation. Dr. Raiser, I want to ask your assessment of what is the role of the Lutheran World Federation in the ecumenical movement and the relations between the LWF and the WCC.
Daniel Rajkumar, working for the WCC's Office on Interreligious Dialogue and Cooperation. I realized that you joined the WCC just before the subunit on interreligious dialogue was being set up. I want you to say something about the initial challenges that the Council faced in terms of embracing interreligious dialogue as an agenda for the Council.
Doug Chill, staff member of the World Council. Dr. Raiser, you've seen many changes in your service and during your leadership for the ecumenical movement, and your book is a treasure. I would ask you if you have any reflections you'd like to share with us on your spiritual journey. Many things have changed, but our devotion to John 17:21, as represented in the tapestry, has always been a foundation. If you could say how that scripture has informed your service and how you have lived your own spiritual journey with that calling.
My name is Jacques Matte. I'm a former staff member in the mission department. But I pick up a mark by Agnes and Konrad on the workers' question and people's movements. My feeling was that the urban rural mission work had something to do with that approach. Now that isn't anymore as such in WCC, but I would like you to comment on this.
Okay, I think you should have a chance to share some responses to this.
Yeah, thank you for these questions and remarks. First, on the question of the role of the WCC, the LWF, and relationships between the World Council and LWF. Rolf Deffenbaugh knows that I have a particular history in that regard, having been involved over the years in several efforts on staff level and then beyond staff to try and clarify these relationships, since obviously we are very close in our mandate as organizations. We share the same member churches, at least as far as they are Lutheran, and I had been hoping for a long time that we might arrive at a closer interaction between the LWF and the WCC, closer interaction also between the LWF and the Reformed Alliance, since at least in a significant part of their shared constituency, these churches had moved towards one another in establishing church fellowship. So this should have been reflected also on the way they organize their communions on the global level. But I have finally come to the conclusion that this is probably a hope that has a certain eschatological value. That is to say, the interest in maintaining traditional identities is getting stronger, particularly as the processes of transformation are speeding up. So it's an inevitable and natural reaction to processes of global change that inherited identities are being reaffirmed. And in the case of the Lutheran World Federation, of course, this concerns in particular the small Lutheran churches, for whom the LWF is the common instrument relating or establishing their link to the wider Christian community. As members of the World Council of Churches, which most of them are as well, they are a tiny, tiny minority. Whereas in the LWF, they do represent something visibly. And therefore, I can respect and can recognize their interest in maintaining that instrument of mutually affirming their identity and also practicing the essential quality of mutual accountability. I think that we have come to a recognition that the Lutheran World Federation, together with other Christian world communions, do play a particular significant role within the wider ecumenical movement. And we hope that we find ways of acknowledging our respective roles without a sense of institutional competitiveness. The WCC as an institutional reality trying to hold together and to bring into interaction the different manifestations of the ecumenical movement should be able to draw the Lutheran World Federation much more actively into our common agendas. Jorgo knows about the long processes that we followed through in trying to see whether, at least on the level of our institutional expression through assemblies, we could bring the different bodies together. In Germany, this has now led to the factual merger of the institutional realities of Lutherans, Reformed, United in one framework. I think we will have to wait for some time that something like this would be possible on the global level between LWF and WCC. The question on interreligious dialogue, it is true, I joined the World Council just a year before the subunit on dialogue with people of living faiths and at that time and ideologies began its work. Stanley Samarta was one of my most important mentors and teachers in the early stages because he had this very penetrating way to spell out the particular challenge that interreligious dialogue posed to the Christian community and to the life and witness of the World Council of Churches. And I think he has, it's mainly due to Stanley and then to Wesley Aryaraja to have marked the interreligious dialogue as an indispensable part of our ecumenical calling. I have expressed my doubts, and Stanley and Wesley knows about this. I have expressed my doubts whether we should move all the way to change or open our understanding of ecumenism to embrace the interreligious reality. And I still feel that we have reason to not insist, but to acknowledge that ecumenism not only has its historical roots, but has an internal reason to be acknowledged as pointing to the links between Christian churches. We do not have a similar succinct conceptual way to point to the interreligious reality, the relationship between people of different faiths, but that this belongs to our understanding of the place of the churches in today's world. That is inscribed very, very centrally into our self-understanding. Doug, you asked about my spiritual journey, and you have linked it with a reference to the particular legacy of John 17, that they all may be one. I think one of my the lessons that I learned was that we need to supplement John 17 by Ephesians 1. That is to say, move beyond the look at the community of those who follow Christ, that they all may be one, and acknowledge that we are only one element in that plan of God to which Ephesians 1 points, that plan of God to bring everything together in heaven and on earth under God's care and purpose. So this opening of my spiritual understanding beyond the ecclesial Christological perspective and the tendency that I perceive existed in the ecumenical movement and also in the Word Council churches, to a Christocentric, ecclesiocentric spirituality, to open this up towards that sense of the panta, the whole in heaven and on earth, as being part of God's purpose for humankind. That describes probably best the spiritual journey that I have been passing through. And finally, I'm grateful to Jacques Maté to point to the urban-rural mission, which was one way of acknowledging the working people's experience, in particular through the Asian movement of urban and rural mission. And we did experience the creative tension between the work of CCPD on the one hand and the work of URM on the other hand. Different methodologies, and the URM methodology definitely rooted in the local experience of people, whereas CCPD had to take seriously the broader international and global structures. So in that sense, it was an important continuous reminder, and it's to some extent it's a sad reality that this has disappeared, as so many other manifestations of our earlier journey have disappeared.
Okay, I think we could take one or two more.
Konrad, one of the greatest gifts you brought to the ecumenical movement was that you were a very strong link between the academy and the council. And from the very beginning of the World Council of Churches, the academy, and especially also the seminaries around the world, and their leadership were closely linked to us. And it is generally believed that from the 60s, somehow the relationship between the academy and the council had begun to dissipate, and that because of this we do not have generations of pastors and students who are brought up in the ecumenical tradition. So I just want you to reflect on the state of the relationship between the academy and the ecumenical movement today, and what have we lost, or is it by all the emphasis and participation we gain much more than what we lost in the academy? I thought that would be a good reflection from you to hear. Thank you.
My name is Kerstin Kolander and I come from Church of Sweden. Thank you very much, Konrad. This is, and Jorgo and Agnes and Olav, it's a privilege to listen to this wealth of ecumenical history. I was curious to hear if you could say something about how you see the formation of the ACT Alliance in all of the challenges that we're trying to address together as an ecumenical movement. And it was interesting that Rally asked the question about the Lutheran World Federation and WCC and the various tasks and how this evolved. So your reflections on the ACT Alliance would be interesting to hear.
Robert van Beek, a former colleague of Konrad. Konrad, I wanted to pick up three keywords that I heard in the discussion. One is fellowship, of course, the other power, and you mentioned in passing LS Corial and the sharing of resources, the ecumenical sharing of resources study. My recollection of that is that when within that study, at some point, we began to address the power questions in terms of our internal relationships as a fellowship of churches. We reached the limit, and we were unable to go there where we wanted to go. Would you agree with that? Could you comment on that? One more.
Thank you. My name is Anders Gadegaard. I've been member of the Central Committee for 2 periods. Konrad, sorry?
Come closer to the microphone.
closer to the mic. Thank you. Konrad, I joined the World Council in '98 in Harare, precisely as you have described, at the time where internal discussions and difficulties were clear. And I was a newcomer, and I was looking at it with, it disturbed me that it was so difficult for churches around the world to have to cooperate as it at that time. And I see one of your big successes as identifying a way forward for an ecumenical movement that had to turn around the concept of unity into what we later called unity in diversity, and not seeking a closer structural or even ecclesial identity of unity. I think that was amazing to be part of that journey, and the richness of seeing that there is a big value in the differences that should not be hidden away, but even be used together. So my question to you is, now looking into the future, how will we be able to strengthen the unity among the churches, realizing that the differences will not become less in the future because of the necessity, as you just explained with the LWF, because of the necessity of having a local or denomination identity in order to survive in this increasing globalization process? How can we nurture the richness and the differences among us and coming closer at the same time, because the world needs the basic Christian faith and values of humanity and equality, or as we talk about in Europe, that Europe has a Christian soul. How can we manifest together a Christian soul to the world, being so different as we are? Thank you.
I would add one question. As Miriam Weby is not here, but it's also my question. You told about how young you were when you got involved in the World Council of Churches and the Ecumenical movement. And one of the questions we have now, for example, for the next assembly planning is, how will a new generation become not only interested, but really involved and inspired, and see the WCC as their arena for their future and also present energy and actions for changing the world? Can you say one thing from the legacy you have that actually can also be of great relevance today to make that happen? Among many.
Yeah, many thanks again. Wonderful questions, and would be worth digging into each of them at greater length. I start with Wesley, because we have shared the experience of serving the World Council of Churches. We've shared the experience of teaching ecumenics, and therefore that link between the WCC and the ecumenical movement on the one hand, and the academy at the university on the other hand, is of obvious vital interest to us. I have regretted the fact that after a period following the Second Vatican Council, where particular teaching positions on ecumenism were established in practically all seminaries and faculties, most of them have been closed, removed today, partly under financial pressure, but partly also because in the consciousness of the churches, the question of ecumenism has moved down to a much, much lower level on the agenda, if it appears on the agenda at all. And therefore, the need to shape a new generation of church workers academically in developing a consciousness for the ecumenical movement has not been felt as strongly as it used to. I'm very happy that my former faculty in Bochum, in spite of all the pressures, has maintained the chair on ecumenics and ecumenical theology as part of systematic theology. And I hope that your efforts will be continued in Drew after your retirement as well. I think one of the ways in which the WCC has begun to contribute to re-establish that link is through the instrument of global ecumenical institutes or summer schools, or of course the graduate school of Bosse. And I've taught in Bosse for one term and been able to accompany some of the students and witness how the encounter and the exposure to the realities of the work and the life of the World Council of Churches has changed their theological perception. And they have taken this back. The Global Ecumenical Institute is an excellent opportunity, and Faith and Order has begun to draw young theologians, men and women, into all of their conferences, and thus use the WCC through its activities also as a teaching concept and a teaching environment, a learning environment, not simply trying to work towards definitive results and proclamations, but to draw a new generation into the process itself. And my experience continues to be as it was when I started as a teacher in Bochum. Once you offer this opportunity to young people to get a first-hand experience and hands-on ecumenical processes, the response is doesn't wait for long. It opens new perspectives to them, and you can be sure that this will be continuing. So this is, in a way, a response also to your question, Olav. Yeah, the ACTA lines. This probably wasn't so innocent a question because you knew whom you were asking about this. And you probably knew about my struggles with colleagues in the process of the formation of the ACTA Alliance, first from ACTA International, then ACTA Development, and then ACTA Alliance. And you know about my regret that this led to a process of growing estrangement between the broad field of responsibility and activity grouped under ACT and the realities of the WCC and the life of the Fellowship of Churches. For the ACT Alliance, the competitive presence among the network of international humanitarian and development-oriented organizations became more important than their roots in the Fellowship of Churches and in the life of the churches. I notice that there is a process underway now among the people responsible for the ACT Alliance and the organizations that are grouped to try and acknowledge the roots that they have come from and to re-establish that link that did exist as long as we had a commission on interchurch aid, refugee and world service, and had a commission on the church's participation in development. It was partly as a process of the move of the agencies away from the World Council of Churches and the allegedly too laborious processes of decision-making in the World Council of Churches that finally forced us to abolish the two commissions, the two instruments that the World Council of Churches had to engage with the churches locally in those processes related to development and all the rest of it. So maybe the process that is now taking shape under the promising but also somewhat ambiguous title of Ecumenical Diaconia may help us to come back to where we had been already once, and thus to re-acknowledge part of our own identity and legacy again in a different environment now. And to some extent this also responds to what Hubert has said. I have, of course, been associated and accompanied Hubert and colleagues in this process leading up to the consultation in Electorial on koinonia, sharing life and community, which was, I think, the most far-reaching and the most penetrating effort of the World Council of Churches in the not easy relationship between the different instruments that had developed the churches, the Commission on World Mission and Evangelism with its expression on urban and rural mission, the Commission on Interchurch Aid, Refugee and World Service, and the Commission on the Church's Participation and Development, to come to a new understanding of our commitment and our common discipline on sharing resources ecumenically, beyond the purely material sharing, material and personal resources, but resources as referring to all the gifts that we have received as people of God. This was followed up by the process on discerning the way together. And there are lots of commitments and promises that have been written into reports and documents. But unfortunately, we were not able to really push through to the point of implementing the commitments and the promises that were written. So again, I look forward with some halted interest to the process that has now been started under the heading of Ecumenical Diaconia. Maybe it can be turned into a new opportunity. Let's hope it will.
I'm sure we could have had many more questions and also many more things to discuss, actually. But the time is out, and we should move forward in our program. I would like to add two comments, though. One is that my first meeting with Konrad was in his office, a day he should not be in the office because he had a cold. But he had made an appointment with a PhD student from Norway to respond to some questions. And he came to the office for that purpose. And we had a very significant conversation for me about why mutual accountability is a significant key to understand many of the discussions in the World Council of Churches and also in Faith Nord and other of the ecumenical bodies. And you helped me to believe in that project, but also to see the opportunities in many ways. And I think what we have discussed today is actually also about how are we mutually accountable both to one another as churches, but also to one another as different generations in this ecumenical movement. As we are called to show that this is also a quality of relations that we should share with the whole world. In our interfaith relations, in our advocacy work, in our diaconical work in many ways. But that was a very important link for me, and it was a sign of your commitment to help the next generations forward. And this publishing of your book is another sign of your commitment to do that. So I really want to thank you for doing this and also giving this time and energy to us and to have this moment. But I have one more comment. And that is, I hear that actually we should have spent more time, Konrad, because I have more to tell you about what is happening today. There are more answers than you are aware of about what is happening in the Council and in our related activities in other in the churches and in other organizations that could also illuminate some of the questions where you are, in a way, disappointed that not more happened. But that we can do another time.
Yeah.
Now we should enjoy fellowship in the lobby, the reception, and there is also then time for a tray lunch in cell 2 and 3 at 12:30. And again, the opportunity then to see the film made by Elisabeth Raiser, which calls The Kreisgang, a film about Father Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. That will be then shown here in the hall at 2 o'clock. And let us use all the opportunities to interact with one another. Thank you. And Agnes, please. One moment, one word, last word to Dr. Agnes.
I'm not taking your time from the aperitif, but just to take this opportunity to sincerely thank you for coming, and also to thank the General Secretary for organizing this day for us. It's been a very, very wonderful day, and I think we are going to interact and share and reconnect on the pilgrimage. Thank you very much.